Hello, and welcome to week 2 of professional and ethical conduct for behavior analysts. This week, I want to start by putting ethical issues into a context. I think oftentimes ethical, moral, and legal issues all get mixed up somewhat. They get confused, and sometimes the differences among them can cause some ethical dilemmas. So let's define each of them. Ethical issues refer to a code of conduct that is adopted by a profession to increase that organization's chances for survival. It's a very functional reason for ethical issues, and we talked about that last week. You read about the chapter in Bailey and Birch talking about the Sunland fiasco and why following that and other atrocities like that, that guidelines were beginning to be developed so that we could increase the chances that the field of applied behavior analysis could survive. But there's also moral issues, and those, of course, are personal beliefs that are based on a person's philosophies and or religious beliefs. And then there's legal issues, which are the state and federal laws. Now, moral codes are usually much stricter than ethical guidelines, and certainly stricter than laws. So, for example, depending upon what your moral codes are, or your morals are, they may determine the people that you hang out with, what you say, how you dress, what kind of work you do, even the things that you think, the thoughts that you think. On the other hand, ethical guidelines are less strict. They really only cover the time that you are functioning as a behavior analyst. Now, that could be, clinically, being a supervisor, being a supervisee, being teaching, being a student, but doing research, but it only covers much more limited than moral codes, because it only covers your behavior as a behavior analyst. And finally, legal issues are probably the least strict, because there's many things that might be a moral or ethical violation that are not against the law. For example, misleading people. If a behavior analyst misled a client by indicating that they were absolutely the best behavior analyst in New England, well, that's not against the law. It may or may not be violate an individual's morals, depending upon what those are, but it certainly violates the ethical code. On the other hand, when we're looking at these three moral, legal, and ethical issues, on the other hand, ethical issues are generally much less prohibitive, but the penalties for violating them are more severe. So, for example, what are the penalties for violating a moral code, which is very strict? Well, it's stricter, but the penalties are less. It's basically you feel guilty. You violate a moral code, one of your own moral codes, the penalty is generally feeling guilty. Okay. There's this whole issue of, depending on what your moral beliefs are, of eternal damnation. But let's take that off the table for right now and really just talk about the penalty for violating a moral code is you're not going to feel good about yourself. On the other hand, the penalty for violating an ethical code is what? Well, you might get sanctioned by the board. You could if it's egregious enough, you might even lose your BCBA certification, but that's it. However, what are the penalties for violating a law? Well, you could be fined. You could go to prison. If you live in the state of Texas, you could get a lethal injection. So obviously, when we're thinking about these, you've got to think about the moral codes are stricter, then followed by ethical codes generally, and then by laws. However, the penalties are much greater for violating laws than they are for ethical or moral codes. The other thing you've got to keep in mind about this is that you can't use an excuse of violating an ethical code because it's counter to a moral code that you have. So every field, we talked yesterday, last week, that every field that works within the helping professions has some kind of professional standards or guidelines or codes, which are often very similar. And those guidelines or codes, like the BCBA guidelines that we'll be studying this semester, are guidelines, rules of practice that provide direction for the practices associated with that particular organization. However, all of the helping professions are based on some kind of moral principles that underlie our culture at large. So in Chapter 2 of Bailey and Birch's book that you're going to read this week, they talk about some of those basic moral principles that underlie our culture at large. And these represent aspirational goals. They're not enforceable rules, but they're aspirational goals. However, I believe that these core ethical principles, if you will, sometimes are very, very useful when we're trying to resolve an ethical dilemma, trying to think some things through. And I'll give some examples of that later on. So these core ethical principles assist professionals in arriving at an ethical course of action. Birch and Bailey in Chapter 2 talk about them in general. I'm going to talk about them here. These are the ones that the APA, American Psychological Association, includes as their preamble. I also included a copy of these. It's only a page or page and a half long. There's only 5 of them. And I'm going to cover them here. But these are the APA's core ethical principles, which means these are their aspirational goals that their principles are based upon. These are really very similar to what Birch and Bailey talk about in Chapter 2. Again, across all the helping professions, these are generally the same thing. They're just sort of organized differently or talked about differently. So the first one is benevolence and non-malfeasance. It's really the most basic core moral principle that underlies all of our guidelines, which means we strive to try to help people. We want to help people. We want to help people get better. However, at the very least, don't do any harm. And your book really has, Birch and Bailey have a great example of that in Chapter 2 with one of the examples they gave. I believe his name was Herman. It's a story that a lot of us, I think, are familiar with. As I recall it, Herman, a behavior analyst, is called in to write a behavior support plan for an individual with an intellectual disability living in a group home. because he is becoming physically aggressive at shower time because he wants to resist taking a shower. As you know, at that particular time when people are naked, wet, in the bathroom where there's a lot of dangerous, slippery things, it's very easy for people to get hurt, both the individuals and staff. And this particular example, several staff persons were hurt in trying to control Herman's behavior during shower time. So initially it seemed like, hey, we need to maybe have a restraint procedure in here in order to ensure the safety of the staff and the safety of Herman. However, and so the behavior analyst wrote that. However, in looking at it a little more closely, the behavior analyst learned that recently Herman's shower time routine had changed. He used to do it in the mornings. Now the staff that was doing it in the mornings with him left. Now the new staff were making him do it at night. There was a certain routine, his favorite towel, he picked out the temperature, that the new staff weren't implementing, that the old staff did. The other procedure resulted in him being very compliant with the shower. Well, now it's a different story. Now writing a restraint procedure really represents doing harm. Not only are you not doing any good, but you're actually doing harm. And what needs to be done, obviously, in this case is change the procedure back to the way it worked before. Another underlying core ethical principle of the BCBA guidelines is fidelity and responsibility. Obviously, if we are going to ensure the survival of applied behavior analysis, people have to believe that we're trustworthy and we take responsibility for what we do. Integrity, another obvious one, but behavior analysts promote accuracy, honesty, truthfulness in science, teaching, and the practice of psychology. Justice. Everyone has the right and access to benefit from applied behavior analysis, and behavior analysts do not allow personal biases or limits of competence or experience to lead to unjust practices. This is where some of the ethical dilemmas can come to play, where your personal biases or your moral code get in the way of ethically what you're supposed to be doing with someone. Another core ethical principle is respect for people's rights and dignity. So behavior analysts respect the rights and dignity of all people. Behavior analysts recognize that more vulnerable people may need extra safeguards, and they do not discriminate based upon age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, etc. Now, here already, these, as I mentioned, are aspirational goals. However, they can create some conflicts. It is not a black and white field, nor are the guidelines. So here we're saying behavior analysts don't discriminate based upon age, gender, sexual orientation, etc. On the other hand, we just talked about that behavior analysts do not allow personal biases or limits of competence to lead to unjust practices. So on the one hand, if you did have a very strong moral beliefs about something and you felt you really couldn't do a good job with someone, well, on the one hand, it says you don't discriminate. But on the other hand, it says you can't let that get in the way, but maybe it's going to, it is going to get in the way. How do you resolve that particular kind of conflict? Those are some of the ethical dilemmas that arise when looking at looking at some of these core ethical principles can help to resolve some of those. All right. The other chapter I asked you to read is chapter 16, if you recall, last week you read Cooper's chapter on ethics, and Cooper essentially said that ethics addresses three questions, the first of which is, what is worth doing? Well, Birch and Bailey suggest that one of the most straightforward ways to determine what is worth doing is by conducting a risk-benefit analysis. They specifically suggest after you do a good, thorough, functional assessment, look at the literature, see what kind of interventions to use, then you should do some kind of a risk a risk-benefit analysis. They specifically suggest that it should look like this. You assess the risk factors of the behavioral procedure. So what are the risk factors? And the most benign behavioral procedure could have some kind of risk factors, extinction bursts, etc. Assess the general risk factors of behavioral treatment. So just in general, there's got to be data collection, there's going to be time involved, everybody's got to be on the same page. Assess the benefits of the behavioral treatment. Okay, well, what would happen if we don't deal with this particular behavior problem? And what are the benefits of having us address this behavior problem successfully? And then finally, reconciling those risks and those benefits with the key shareholders involved in the case. Obviously, presenting the risks and benefits to the consumer allows for frank and honest discussion so that no one is surprised if unexpected side effects of a treatment occur. To me, this is the best way of dealing with an ethical problem. Just like those of you who have had me in class before when we're talking about treatments have heard me say, I think the best way of dealing with the behavior problem is through antecedent interventions and avoiding ever having the behavior problem. I think it's the same thing with ethical problems, ethical dilemmas rather, is we need to understand them. And then once we really understand what the most obvious ethical problems or most common ethical problems are, that we can put things in place like a good risk benefit analysis in, and we could avoid some of those ethical issues. All right, so this week you're going to read chapters 2 and 16 in Bailey and Birch. I've included on the website a copy of the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists preamble. So I just want you to read. It has a few of the general principles on it also. I didn't take those out, but it's really just 5A through E ethical principles of the preamble, which are those underlying core moral codes that underlie the general principles. I want you to read those. And the assignment this week is to conduct a risk-benefit analysis and follow, I don't really care what format you use, but if you haven't done this before, follow the example would be figure 16.4 in the Bailey and Birch book for a behavior support plan. So assume that you were called into a case. The target behavior was tantruming in a 5-year-old. So you are going to develop a behavior support plan to decrease tantruming that would include differential parent attention. So the behavioral intervention would be differential parent attention. And I want you to do a risk-benefit analysis similar to what you see in figure 16.4 of Bailey and Birch for that particular intervention of differential parent attention. I think doing these risk-benefit analyses, I've started doing them a while ago, and I find them to really, really be useful. So I'll be interested in your take on those, how you feel, how useful you feel that would be in developing plans and then sharing that with the caregivers, the parents, the individual themselves, if that's appropriate. Okay, so that's it for this week. Have a good week, and if you have, again, questions, comments that would benefit everyone, please go to the discussion forum. Otherwise, email me, and I will be in touch next week. See ya.